The Grand Ole Opry has long been called the heart of country music, a place where legends are honored and history is preserved. But behind that iconic stage lies a harsher truth. Some of the biggest country icons didn't just fall out of favor, they were quietly pushed aside, rejected, or even erased. From wild rebels to modern superstars, these artists all crossed a line. The question is, did they deserve it? Or did the Opry turn its back too soon? Asterisk 10. Chris Christopherson. When people talk about artists who reshaped the soul of country music, Chris Christopherson is always near the top of that list. Before fame, he was a Rhodes Scholar, a helicopter pilot, and a songwriter who brought an entirely different kind of depth into Nashville. His songs weren't just catchy melodies, they were raw, honest portraits of flawed human beings. Tracks like Me and Bobby McGee and Sunday Morning Comin' Down didn't try to clean up reality, they exposed it. And that was exactly what made him both revolutionary and deeply uncomfortable for institutions like the Grand Ole Opry. At the time Chris emerged, the Grand Ole Opry stood as a symbol of tradition. It represented a polished, family-friendly version of country music, one that avoided controversy and stayed within clearly defined lines. Chris Christopherson didn't just step outside those lines, he ignored them entirely. His lyrics spoke openly about loneliness, addiction, regret, and broken lives. His sound leaned toward folk and rock influences, and his attitude reflected a generation that no longer wanted to be controlled by Nashville's old rules. There was no official announcement, no headline declaring that Chris Christopherson had been banned. But in many ways, what happened to him was more subtle, and perhaps more telling. He was never fully embraced by the Grand Ole Opry. He wasn't a regular presence on that stage, nor was he elevated as one of its central figures. Instead, he existed on the outside looking in. In an industry where acceptance by the Opry often defined legitimacy, that distance spoke volumes. But what the Opry hesitated to accept, the rest of the world began to celebrate. Chris became a defining voice of the outlaw country movement, a shift led by artists who rejected the control of the Nashville system. Alongside figures like Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, he helped create a new identity for country music, one built on authenticity rather than approval. Ironically, by not fully embracing him, the Opry may have pushed him towards something even bigger. And that's where the story takes its most interesting turn. Because while the Grand Ole Opry remained rooted in tradition, Chris Christopherson helped push country music forward. His influence spread far beyond any single stage, shaping generations of artists who valued truth over image. So the question isn't just why Chris Christopherson never truly belonged to the Grand Ole Opry, it's whether the Grand Ole Opry failed to recognize a voice that would outgrow them all. 9. Tanya Tucker. Tanya Tucker wasn't just a country star, she was a phenomenon. She burst onto the scene as a teenager with a voice that sounded far older than her years, delivering songs filled with emotion, pain, and confidence that few artists could match. By the time most people were finishing high school, Tanya was already a chart-topping artist, performing on the biggest stages in country music. She had everything the industry claimed to want: talent, charisma, and undeniable star power. But she also had something else, something the Grand Ole Opry didn't quite know how to handle. As Tanya grew older, her image began to shift. She wasn't interested in fitting into the traditional mold of a proper country star. While the Opry continued to represent a polished, conservative version of country music, Tanya embraced a more rebellious lifestyle. Her relationships, her nightlife, and her unapologetic attitude quickly became tabloid headlines. She was no longer just known for her music, she was known for controversy. And in Nashville, especially within institutions like the Grand Ole Opry, that kind of attention could be dangerous. There was no dramatic moment where Tanya Tucker was officially banned from the Opry. No single scandal that triggered an immediate rejection. Instead, what happened was slower, quieter, but just as powerful. Invitations became less frequent. Appearances became rare. The distance between Tanya and the Opry grew wider over time until it became clear that she was no longer part of that inner circle. In an industry built on relationships and reputation, being quietly pushed aside can be more damaging than any public fallout. But Tanya Tucker never stopped being a star. Even as the Opry kept its distance, she continued to record music, tour, and maintain a loyal fan base. In fact, her refusal to conform became part of her identity. She represented a different kind of country artist, one who didn't need validation from traditional institutions to prove her worth. And in many ways, that independence made her even more compelling. Years later, the narrative around Tanya began to shift. The same industry that once seemed unsure about her started to recognize her legacy. She received critical acclaim, awards, and a renewed level of respect that had long been overdue. But the question still lingers. Why did it take so long? Tanya Tucker's story isn't about a single moment of rejection. It's about something more subtle, the way the Grand Ole Opry and the system around it struggled to accept an artist who refused to play by its rules. She wasn't cast out overnight. She was gradually left behind. And that raises a deeper question. Was Tanya Tucker ever truly rejected by the Grand Ole Opry, or was she simply too real for what it wanted her to be? Part 8. George Jones. Few voices in country music history are as instantly recognizable or as emotionally devastating as George Jones. Often called the greatest country singer of all time, his ability to convey heartbreak was unmatched. Songs like He Stopped Loving Her Today didn't just top charts, they defined what country music could be at its most powerful. On stage, George Jones was perfection, but off stage, he was something entirely different. And that's where his relationship with the Grand Ole Opry began to fracture. At his peak, George Jones had everything: hit records, sold-out shows, and the respect of his peers. But behind the scenes, his life was spiraling. Alcohol and substance abuse took control, and with it came a pattern that the industry could no longer ignore. He missed shows. He arrived late. Sometimes he didn't show up at all. The unpredictability became part of his reputation. So much so that fans jokingly nicknamed him No-Show Jones. But for institutions like the Grand Ole Opry, there was nothing funny about it. The Opry represented reliability, professionalism, and tradition. It was a place where artists were expected to honor the stage and the audience every single time. George Jones, despite his immense talent, began to clash with those expectations. His absences and erratic behavior created tension behind the scenes. And while there was no single headline-grabbing ban, the consequences were clear. The Opry distanced itself. Opportunities became limited. Trust was broken. What makes George Jones's story so compelling is the contrast. Here was a man whose voice could bring an audience to tears, yet his personal life kept pulling him away from the very stage that celebrated that voice. It wasn't a lack of talent that pushed him to the edge. It was everything else. And yet, unlike some others on this list, George Jones's story didn't end in quiet exile. After years of struggle, he began to rebuild his life. He got sober, he regained control, and slowly, he earned back the respect he had once risked losing. In time, the industry, including the Grand Ole Opry, welcomed him back, not just as a performer, but as a survivor. But even with redemption, the damage had already been done. There was a period where one of the greatest voices in country music history was effectively pushed to the margins of its most iconic stage. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because he couldn't meet the expectations that came with it. So the question remains, did the Grand Ole Opry turn its back on George Jones? Or did George Jones, in his darkest moments, turn away from it first? Garth Brooks. By the early 1990s, Garth Brooks wasn't just a country star. He was a global phenomenon. He shattered sales records, filled massive arenas, and brought a level of energy to country music that hadn't been seen before. His concerts felt more like rock shows, his stage presence was explosive, and his ambition seemed limitless. In many ways, he redefined what a country artist could be. But for an institution like the Grand Ole Opry, which had long stood as a guardian of tradition, Garth Brooks represented something unfamiliar and perhaps a little unsettling. From the beginning, Garth's relationship with the Opry was respectful but distant. He performed there. He honored its history, but he was never truly woven into its fabric the way earlier legends had been. Part of that came down to timing. By the time Garth rose to fame, the industry itself was changing. Country music was expanding beyond Nashville, reaching new audiences, new markets, and new expectations. And Garth was at the center of that expansion. But with that growth came tension. The Grand Ole Opry had always been about consistency, tradition, and a certain kind of identity. Garth Brooks, on the other hand, was about evolution. He pushed boundaries in ways that didn't always align with what the Opry represented. His theatrical performances, his crossover appeal, and even his business decisions set him apart from the traditional country establishment. He wasn't rejecting the Opry, but he also wasn't relying on it. There was no scandal, no dramatic fallout, no official rejection. And yet, Garth Brooks never became a central figure within the Grand Ole Opry. He wasn't part of its core circle, nor did he build his legacy around that stage. Instead, he built something bigger, a career that extended far beyond the limits of any single institution. And that's what makes his story so different from the others on this list. Garth Brooks wasn't pushed out because of controversy or personal struggles. If anything, he outgrew the system. The Opry didn't turn its back on him in the traditional sense, but it also couldn't fully contain what he became. In a way, this was a quiet separation. Two powerful forces in country music moving in different directions. The Opry stayed rooted in its traditions, while Garth Brooks carried country music into stadiums, into new generations, and into a global spotlight. So the question isn't whether Garth Brooks was rejected. It's whether the Grand Ole Opry was ever equipped to fully embrace someone like him in the first place. 6. Willie Nelson. Before he became one of the most beloved figures in American music, Willie Nelson was a struggling songwriter trying to survive inside a system that didn't quite understand him. In the early years of his career, Nashville had a very clear idea of what country music should sound like: polished, controlled, and commercially safe. Willie didn't fit that mold. His voice was unconventional, his phrasing was loose, and his songwriting carried a kind of emotional honesty that didn't always align with what producers wanted at the time. For the Grand Ole Opry, which embodied those traditional values, Willie Nelson was never an obvious fit. In fact, for a long time, he wasn't part of that world at all. While other artists were building their reputations through regular appearances on the Opry stage, Willie was fighting to be heard. He wrote hits for other artists, songs that would go on to become classics, but his own career struggled to gain traction within the Nashville system. The doors weren't completely closed to him, but they were never fully open either. Frustrated with the limitations, Willie made a decision that would change everything. He left Nashville. That move wasn't just geographic, it was symbolic. Willie Nelson walked away from the expectations, the control, and the unwritten rules that had defined country music for decades. He went to Texas, grew his hair long, embraced a different lifestyle, and began making music on his own terms. And in doing so, he became one of the central figures of the outlaw country movement, a wave of artists who rejected the Nashville establishment and built something entirely new. From the perspective of the Grand Ole Opry, this was a turning point. Willie Nelson wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was part of a movement that challenged everything the Opry stood for. The traditional system no longer had authority over him, and in return, it never fully claimed him as one of its own. He wasn't banned, he wasn't publicly rejected, but he existed outside the circle, by choice, but also by consequence. And yet, that distance is exactly what made Willie Nelson a legend. While the Opry remained a symbol of tradition, Willie became a symbol of freedom. His career flourished without needing validation from Nashville's most iconic stage. Albums like Red-Headed Stranger redefined artistic control in country music, proving that authenticity could resonate far beyond the limits of industry expectations. So, when we look back, it's hard to say who turned their back on whom. Did the Grand Ole Opry fail to embrace Willie Nelson? Or did Willie Nelson simply walk away from a system that could never contain him? 5. Waylon Jennings. Waylon Jennings didn't just challenge the Nashville system. He helped break it. In the early years of his career, Wallen was exactly the kind of artist the industry believed it could shape. He had the voice, the look, and the potential to become a polished country star. Like many others, he was placed into a tightly controlled recording environment where producers dictated everything, from the sound of his music to the musicians he worked with. It was the Nashville way, and for a while, Wallen played along. But underneath that surface, something wasn't right. Waylon Jennings didn't want to be controlled. He didn't want to sound like everyone else. And most importantly, he didn't want his music to be decided by someone sitting behind a studio glass window. The more success he found, the more he began to push back. He wanted creative freedom. something that at the time was almost unheard of in country music. That tension didn't just affect his recordings. It extended to the entire system that surrounded Nashville, including institutions like the Grand Ole Opry. The Opry represented tradition, discipline, and a very specific image of what a country artist should be. Waylon Jennings represented the opposite. He grew his hair long, rejected the clean-cut image, and embraced a lifestyle that didn't fit within the boundaries the Opry had upheld for decades. But more than anything, he rejected control. Eventually, Waylon made a bold decision. He demanded the right to produce his own music. It was a turning point not just for his career, but for the entire genre. When he walked away from the Nashville system and joined forces with artists like Willie Nelson, the outlaw movement was born. This wasn't just a musical shift, it was a rebellion. And from that moment on, Waylon Jennings was no longer part of the traditional country establishment. The Grand Ole Opry didn't issue a dramatic ban. There was no single incident that defined the break, but the distance was undeniable. Waylon wasn't a regular presence on that stage. He wasn't embraced as one of its central figures. In many ways, he stood outside of it, not because he couldn't be inside, but because he refused to play by its rules. And that's what makes his story so powerful. Because while the Opry continued to protect its traditions, Waylon Jennings helped redefine the future of country music. His success proved that artists didn't need to conform to succeed. They could take control, break the rules, and still reach the top. So in the end, the question becomes even more complicated. Did the Grand Ole Opry turn its back on Waylon Jennings? Or did Waylon Jennings become too independent for the Opry to ever hold on to? 4. Morgan Wallen. At one point, Morgan Wallen seemed unstoppable. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, he had become one of the biggest names in modern country music. His songs dominated streaming platforms, his albums broke records, and his fan base continued to grow at a pace few artists could match. He represented a new era, one where country music blended with pop and hip-hop influences, reaching audiences far beyond its traditional roots. But just as quickly as he rose, everything changed. In 2021, a video surfaced that would alter the trajectory of his career overnight. The footage showed Morgan Wallen using a racial slur outside his home, a moment that immediately sparked national outrage. Within days, radio stations pulled his music, industry events distanced themselves, and major organizations took action. Among them was the Grand Ole Opry. Wallen had already performed on the Opry stage before the scandal, a milestone that signaled acceptance into one of country music's most respected institutions. But after the incident, that relationship was abruptly cut off. The Opry removed him from scheduled appearances, effectively shutting the door on one of the genre's biggest stars at the peak of his visibility. Unlike many others on this list, this wasn't subtle. It was immediate, public, and impossible to ignore. From the Opry's perspective, the decision was about protecting its image. The organization has long positioned itself as a symbol of country music's values, tradition, respect, and community. Allowing Morgan Wallen to continue performing under those circumstances would have sent a message they weren't willing to stand behind. But what happened next made the story far more complicated. Despite being pulled from radio and major platforms, Morgan Wallen's popularity didn't collapse. It exploded. His album sales surged. His streaming numbers increased. Fans rallied around him in ways that shocked the industry. While institutions distanced themselves, the audience did the opposite, and that created a divide. On one side, the Grand Ole Opry and the traditional gatekeepers of country music. On the other, a massive fan base that continued to support him regardless of the controversy. It raised an uncomfortable question. Who really decides an artist's place in country music? The institutions or the listeners? Over time, the intensity of the situation softened. Conversations about accountability, growth, and redemption began to emerge. But the moment itself, that sudden rejection, remained one of the clearest examples of how quickly the Opry can turn its back when its values are challenged. So the question isn't just whether Morgan Wallen deserved to be removed, it's whether the Grand Ole Opry acted to protect country music or to protect itself. 3. The Chicks. At the height of their fame, the Chicks were untouchable. They weren't just successful, they were dominating country music. Multi-platinum albums, sold-out tours, and a level of mainstream crossover that few country acts had ever achieved. Songs like Wide Open Spaces and Cowboy Take Me Away helped define an era. They had the sound, the image, and the momentum. In many ways, they were exactly what the industry wanted, until one moment changed everything. In 2003, during a concert in London, lead singer Natalie Maines made a comment that would send shockwaves through the entire country music world. Referring to then-President George W. Bush, she said the band was ashamed he was from Texas. It was a brief remark, but in the political climate of the time, it ignited immediate backlash. What followed was unlike anything the genre had seen before. Radio stations across the United States began pulling their music. Fans organized public boycotts. Their CDs were destroyed in highly publicized protests. And within the industry, doors started closing fast. The Chicks, once at the very center of country music, suddenly found themselves pushed to the edge. The Grand Ole Opry didn't issue a formal ban. There was no official statement declaring them unwelcome. But the silence was telling. The band was no longer part of the Opry's world. Appearances stopped. Invitations disappeared. In an institution built on tradition and audience loyalty, aligning with a group at the center of national controversy was a risk the Opry wasn't willing to take. And just like that, one of the biggest acts in country music was effectively erased from its most iconic stage. But the story didn't end there. Instead of fading away, the Chicks made a decision that would redefine their legacy. They stepped outside the country music establishment and reinvented themselves on their own terms. Their 2006 album, Taking the Long Way, became a powerful statement, not just musically, but personally. It earned critical acclaim, multiple Grammy Awards, and proved that they didn't need the approval of Nashville to succeed. Still, the divide remained. For years, the Chicks existed in a strange space, too controversial for traditional country platforms, yet too influential to ignore. Their relationship with institutions like the Grand Ole Opry was never fully repaired, leaving behind a lasting tension between artistry, politics, and industry control. And that's what makes their story so complex. They weren't rejected because of their music. They weren't pushed out because of their talent. They crossed a line that had nothing to do with country music itself. So the real question is this: did the Grand Ole Opry turn its back on the Chicks, or did it simply reflect the reaction of an audience that wasn't ready to hear what they had to say? Shosh 2. Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash was never meant to fit neatly into any system, and that's exactly what made him unforgettable. From the moment he stepped into the spotlight, Cash carried a presence that was darker, deeper, and more unpredictable than most of his peers. His voice was raw. His songs told stories of prisoners, outcasts, and broken souls. While the Grand Ole Opry stood as a symbol of tradition and order, Johnny Cash represented something far more dangerous: truth without polish. And for a while, that tension could be managed. Cash performed at the Opry, gained recognition, and built his name within the country music world. But behind the scenes, his life was unraveling. Addiction began to take hold, and with it came erratic behavior that would eventually spill onto the very stage that had helped elevate him. The breaking point came during one of his performances at the Grand Ole Opry. Under the influence, Johnny Cash began acting out in a way that no one could ignore. In a moment that would become infamous, he smashed stage lights with a microphone stand, an act of destruction that shocked both the audience and the institution itself. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a direct violation of everything the Opry stood for. The response was immediate. Cash was banned from the Grand Ole Opry. For an artist of his stature, this wasn't just a professional setback. It was a public statement. The Opry was drawing a line, making it clear that no level of talent could excuse behavior that threatened its image and values. For Johnny Cash, it marked one of the lowest points in a life already spiraling out of control. But what makes this story different from so many others is what happened next. Johnny Cash didn't disappear. Instead, he began one of the most remarkable comebacks in music history. With the support of June Carter and a renewed commitment to his life and career, he slowly rebuilt himself. He got clean. He found purpose again, and over time, he reclaimed the respect he had once lost. Eventually, the Grand Ole Opry welcomed him back. But the relationship was never quite the same. The incident had left a mark, a reminder of how quickly even the greatest stars could fall, and how unforgiving the system could be when its boundaries were crossed. Yet in a strange way, that very moment helped define Johnny Cash's legacy. Because while the Opry represented tradition, Cash represented something bigger, redemption. So the question isn't just whether the Grand Ole Opry was right to ban Johnny Cash, it's whether that rejection became the turning point that ultimately made him a legend. 1. Hank Williams. If there is one name that defines the very soul of country music, it is Hank Williams. Long before massive arenas, streaming charts, or crossover superstardom, Hank Williams stood at the center of it all. His voice carried a kind of pain that felt real because it was. Songs like Your Cheatin' Heart and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry didn't just entertain. They exposed something deeper, something raw and human that audiences couldn't turn away from. At the Grand Ole Opry, he wasn't just another performer. He was a star, a defining voice of the genre. But behind that brilliance, there was a growing darkness. As Hank's fame exploded, so did his personal struggles. Chronic pain, alcohol abuse, and emotional instability began to take control of his life. What started as occasional issues soon became a pattern the industry could no longer ignore. He missed performances. He showed up late. Sometimes he didn't show up at all. For an institution like the Grand Ole Opry, built on reliability and respect for the stage, this was more than just a problem. It was a breaking point. In 1952, the unthinkable happened. Hank Williams was fired from the Grand Ole Opry. There was no quiet distancing, no subtle exclusion. This was direct, final, and public. The very institution that had helped elevate him now turned its back on him completely. For fans, it was shocking. For Hank, it was devastating. And what makes this moment even more haunting is what came next. Just months after being dismissed from the Opry, Hank Williams was dead. At only 29 years old, the man who had defined country music was gone, leaving behind a legacy that would shape the genre forever. But his final chapter is forever tied to that decision. A legend, cast out at his lowest point with no chance to return. And that's what makes his story the most tragic of all. Because unlike others on this list, Hank Williams never got a second act. No redemption, no comeback, no reconciliation, only questions. Did the Grand Ole Opry make the right decision, protecting its standards at any cost? Or did it abandon one of its greatest stars when he needed support the most? Even today, that moment lingers in the history of country music, a reminder that sometimes the line between discipline and abandonment is far thinner than anyone wants to admit.